So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for giving your time here and coming to listen to my talk. So we are in quite challenging times right now, and there's a global pandemic all around us. However, I feel that we could learn some important lessons when it comes to the field of inclusivity, and that's the topic that I'm deeply passionate about. So today I'll try to touch on those aspects. I work as a QA consultant at Thoughtworks. You can reach me as Lina on Twitter because I do deal with quite a lot of bugs often. But it's a complex topic and we'll be just scratching the top of the iceberg. So let's get going to the agenda. So first of all, I want to give a little foundation of the terms that we're going to use today. We have to understand what is diversity, what is inclusion, also what is privilege and oppression when we say it. Then we as well have to talk, why should we talk about it right now? You may be wondering it from the very start, but bear with me, we'll get through this part. These first two parts may be a little bit hard to digest. It's a lot of information, but in the third part, I will be getting to more bright side and trying to see what were the learnings that we could take from this pandemic and apply them as well when it comes to inclusion. So, a lot of companies in tech talk about diversity and inclusion. They usually have a section in their websites saying, yeah, we care about diversity and inclusion. And our employer, Thoughtworks, is not the exception, right? So we have a section in about inclusivity and that we do care about it. But what do a lot of these companies mean when they use these terms? So diversity's official definition is that it's the combination of differing, various elements or people. However, it's important to understand that it has a lot of dimensions. If we imagine a team which is combined of 5 white, straight men in their 20s, for them, a diverse team member could be someone who's different gender, different race, different sexual orientation. There's so many dimensions of diversity. Often when companies talk about diversity and inclusion, they do tend to concentrate on gender balance ratio, which is a good start. However, we have to be more aware that there's more to that than just gender balance. And some of these things also can be quite minor in a sense, like your choice of the role, right? That you are, let's say, quality analyst as I am, and I'm joining a team where there's only programmers. So there's lots of complexities when it comes to diversity. When I talk about it, often I use the general understanding of it and umbrella term. So I'm not trying to concentrate on any of those aspects the most. Why should we care about diversity? Well, a lot of tech companies did realize that diversity is driving innovation, experiments, and progress. And a very good example of that is in a book, Reset, My Fight for Inclusion and Lasting Change by Ellen Powell, where she shares a story that happened years back. The author joined Reddit, and Reddit at that time was very much, you could say, hiring for culture fit, which means people who loved using Reddit. And the author started to stir things up there a little bit. She started to actually suggest that Reddit would start supporting mobile. Now it seems funny, right? But long back, mobile was just gaining momentum and it was a new thing. And a lot of Reddit's employees thought that the product that they had was great the way it was. Why should they support mobile? Who is going to use it? Because they're just using the desktop version. With a lot of convincing, the author did manage to convince them actually to support mobile. And now it's funny and we couldn't even imagine that they wouldn't support it. But it's a good example that a different perspective, someone who's maybe not as much in love with the product, or at least is willing to see its flaws or improvement areas, could drive a lot of innovation. And The other side of this often is the fact that some companies do say that they are hiring for the more diverse members. They often concentrate on gender balance, but they still get into hiring culture fit, which means people who have similar opinions to them, people who have similar background, even if they do have different genders. So this is a lot of complex things when it comes to diversity. And the thing is that in tech, we are starting to realize that the more diverse the teams are, the companies are, the more we can create products which are inclusive, we could say as well, and more important and relevant to different types of people. So we can do more experiments with this. So definitely diversity is gaining momentum when it comes to tech. But the one thing that I often would see diversity and inclusion together, and I would think that it's sort of straightforward that inclusion comes there. However, just having more experience, I realized that diversity makes inclusion so much harder. The more diverse the team is, the more diverse the group of people is, the harder it is to include everyone, to make them feel happy there. And this is why I got so much into the topic of inclusion, because in hirings, we tend to focus on diversity factors. But if we hire these diverse, amazing professionals, how do we make them stay? How do we make them feel included? So only when I faced some of the pains, and for me personally, it was some sexism in the workplace or having innocent jokes, which are supposed to be normal, I really didn't feel included in some situations that I faced. So this is why I'm focusing on inclusion, and I want to talk about more. So the definition of it is that inclusion is the state of being included. I would explain inclusion in my own words as belonging. Belonging in your own authentic self and not sabotaging someone else's selves, and you still feel like you're happy to be in a certain group. And a very nice example for me is this painting from 1570, which is called Earth. And it's a combination of all diverse, differing animal species which live on Earth. Well, not all, of course. And all of them are included into this beautiful, magnificent painting. So this is a nice example how, this is extraordinary because they are authentic, they are diverse, and they are different from each other, and they all combined make this beautiful thing. And I do feel that the utopia of tech world, as well as working as a quality analyst, often I think that we should have diverse teams which could create these amazing products, but we do have to make sure that people feel included. The difficult part with inclusion is that often we may not see the problems of inclusion, or we may not realize where we should improve unless we face the problems ourselves, or we see them and spot them. And here are a few concepts that I have to get into if I want to talk about this topic more. The one thing is privilege. Privilege is a special immunity, permission, or right, or benefit granted to or enjoyed by an individual, class, or caste. So the interesting part with privilege is often we put a little bit of a negative connotation to this word, and we may think, oh yes, this person is privileged, but me, no way. I worked really hard. I got this with my hard work. A funny anecdote I remember from a movie about white privilege, where the author of this documentary went to interview some people, and there was this garden of white ladies enjoying cocktails, and the author asked, do you believe in white privilege? And they said, no, I worked really hard. I got everything because I work hard, and if there's white privilege, there must be black privilege. Which, is a little bit cringeworthy thing to say. But the important part here is privilege is very often a little bit invisible, or at least invisible to what we have ourselves. It also has lots of dimensions and lots of aspects. It's not only one way or another that makes you privileged. So a nice example I'd like to include here is showing how, you know, our world is working and how there could be these imagined orders. And this is a quote from the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, which was approved in 1776. It states that, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This sounds quite nice, right? Everyone's equal, everyone's got rights. However, the fact with privilege is that it's so invisible to those that have it that it's natural to exclude certain groups of definitions. When this was signed, some of these signers were actually slaveholders. And slavery abolishment in the US was done almost 100 years later after signing this. The other thing with this is that often the signers of Declaration of Independence are referenced as the founding fathers, and they are all men, but one woman in one of the version, or I'm not sure how it goes, of the signed declaration. And women's rights nationally were established only in 1920. So this is showing that when they were signing this, when they said all men are created equal and everyone has unalienable rights, they were not included certain groups of people into this. And society's images do change, and they started being included more. However, it's important to understand privilege is invisible to those who have it. And the one thing that also plays a big role into privilege, inclusion, diversity factors is oppression. For that, I want to show you a little video which explains the 4 eyes of oppression, which for me is such a beautiful explanation. And it also explains how all these things play together and how societies work.
Oppression. It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access. Who is able to get to what and how? This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all 4 of these levels. Thanks for watching.
All right. Oops. So the one thing that we have to remember is that most people in the dominant group are not consciously oppressive. They have internalized the negative messages about other groups and consider their attitudes towards the other group quite normal. So this is the tricky part when it comes to privilege, oppression, diversity, and inclusion. A lot of things we see as normal, a lot of things we do not question. So you may be wondering, why should we talk about all of this now? This is quite heavy stuff. Well, we are in very challenging times, but as Cindy Gallup says, we are in challenging times. The world will never be the same again. But that is a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Well, because it changed so much. Our perfect world that we saw before the pandemic shattered. So we can actually make impact or drive change, which could affect all those 4 I's of oppression, for example. And the one thing that's common is that death, sorrow, pain do not discriminate. The interesting thing is when the Spanish flu pandemic happened, there was also similar kind of activism around the fact that maybe we could make white privilege more obvious and we could learn from this. So I'm not sure if we learned fully from that pandemic, but maybe we could learn from this one as well, because despite of our richness in a sense or certain privileges, a lot of us are facing a lot of uncertainty, anxieties, what you even mentioned about the losses, the pain. So all of these things maybe could help us understand more about the inclusions problems and how we could improve. It is really scary, I would say, but it's really eye-opening as well. Because a lot of problems we are facing are sort of belonging problems. They are sort of inclusivity problems that a lot of people faced before the pandemic as well. But now we are facing this in way greater amounts. Some of them are like feelings of uncertainty about the future. We cannot really have self-expression. We may lose the job. We may struggle to find a new one. If we have a job and we work in remote conditions, there still is a lot of vulnerability in the workplace because you may see the background, you may see the environment, you may see a kid running around who's trying to get attention. And all this is very personal and vulnerable. What you even mentioned about access to medical care, when we see celebrities getting tested with very mild symptoms of COVID, while others struggle to get a test, even if they are showing very difficult symptoms. We also have accessibility issues, and we see that certain systems and setups are not really working when we have to work remote. And most importantly, inequity is more obvious than ever. The one caricature that I really like is this one because it shows that we do romanticize the quarantine and the fact that, we can connect with each other, which is a great thing with songs and somehow communicating via balconies. However, there's so much more in this. There's a lot of medical professionals who are overworked. Deliveries are not stopping. And some Another celebrity has said, oh, I feel like I'm in jail while they were in a mansion. And imagine people who don't have a job anymore, who maybe are locked down in a city they don't even live in, or are now working plus trying to also take care of their kids. This is a very difficult situation, but I feel like we can see the privilege more clearly. It's more obvious that we do have inequity. We want it or not, we're not having the same conditions. And as my colleague has said, during Corona times, people in the media often say, we are in this together. No, we are not. There are always different we, and some are more vulnerable than others. We are never in this together, whatever this is. Did not integrate well enough is often what is said. The cause of exclusion from the we shifted to those who are marginalized. Never truly part of the we, not even after being scrutinized and found worthy of inclusion by some. It is a very difficult topic to talk about and to realize all the inequity that we have around us. However, now I'll try to get into a little bit lighter part because I feel that in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity, as Albert Einstein has said. When the world shattered so much and it changed so much, maybe we can drive change a little bit deeper. Maybe we can rebuild the new normal to be somehow better. And I have a certain lessons that I think we could learn from this pandemic and we could apply them. So I'll try to also say how we could make sure that they still are a valid part of our new normal. And I'll include a few tips as well if you are working remote, what could be done. But the first thing is we have to decide what do we want during COVID. So there are 3 zones, we could say roughly. There's the fear zone when you are hoarding toilet paper and panic buying. But there also are these very powerful zones like learning zone and growth zone when we could actually reflect, we could re-anchor, we could stop a little bit, we could slow down and understand more what we want from life and what's happening all around us. We're not rushing somehow as much as we were before the pandemic. We were forced to stop. So let's take a look at what lessons could be from this pandemic and how could we apply them. So first of all, I think it is time when we can realize what actually matters. Before the pandemic, a lot of us had very different priorities and different plans. But now that the pandemic happened, we realized what matters to us is health. The health of ourselves, the health of our loved ones, people, and the connection matters more. It's funny, you know, before the pandemic, I would speak to my mom once a week or in 2 weeks. Now we speak every day. And she said, you know, that's the one good thing that the pandemic brought. Finally, I can talk to you more because you have time to talk to me. The other thing that we see and we want and we seek more during this pandemic is the empathy and transparency. We want to know what's happening. We want to know that people care about us. We want to know that leaders care about us. We also want accessibility. We want to have access to systems, and we want to be able to work remotely if we have to. And we want to have flexibility, that we want to say, let's say, work in certain hours if we cannot work from 9 to 5 as regular. And all of this for me is leading to inclusion. If we are caring about things that actually matter, maybe you should care about inclusion as well and talk about it more and see how we can learn to be more inclusive. So how could we apply this? Well, first of all, we can question status quo. And questioning status quo, we could do on all different levels during this pandemic, like systems, even governments, right? Even though I don't want to get into politics and I want, the tech example would be in my team, when we went to remote work, we questioned all the meetings we had because maybe some of them do not make sense. Maybe working remote, we could record some of those meetings and just store it somewhere. So if people need context, they could play it in their own pace if they need this information. We don't have to have a meeting just to have it. Maybe some things don't work in a remote setup. So it's time to rebuild our things that we took for granted before the pandemic happened. Then we also can observe how businesses respond to the crisis. So even if we lost jobs, but we can see where would we like to work, because it is a difficult situation and some companies did have to do layoffs, but they still showed some heart and some of them did it gracefully and caringly, while other companies a little bit were showing their bad faces. So maybe it's time to collect more information and see which companies and businesses are actually more empathetic. And we can support empathy over tyranny, and this especially when it comes to leadership, because we do want more care and more empathy rather than micromanaging or certain rules coming from the sky. The one thing that we can do is checking in with our team, friends, and family. We can create water boiler conversations, meaning those conversations when we would just go, in the office to get a cup of tea and we would wait until water boiler makes hot water. And we would meet these random people and we could talk to them. So why don't we do something like that with our team? So in my team, we did tea time, meaning that every day we had a certain amount of time, usually just half an hour, to check in with each other. And this information is extremely useful for connection and as well for work even, because you can understand why a person is acting a certain way. Maybe they are struggling with remote work. And this is extremely important if we believe that people matter. So inclusion matters as well. So we should check in with people and try to understand how they're doing. Even farewell or introduction meetings as well, if you're having certain changes in your team, are extremely important because you can do it remotely. Of course, it's very different, but it's still very nice to have. And with this, I just want to remind you that just because someone carries it all so well, it doesn't mean it's not heavy. And this leads me to another point and lesson, that maybe it's time when we can acknowledge our ignorance, privilege, biases, and gain more information. So the interesting part is that when pandemic happened, we did realize that we cannot be that certain, right? So we faced a lot of uncertainty. And I feel this could be a good wake-up call for us to learn that, hey, if we were uncertain about this, maybe there are more uncertain things like our own views. Maybe we do not know everything. And it's a good time to somehow open our eyes with this. And the one thing that we could do here is to give our full attention when we are talking to people. Imagine situations when someone listens to you with their full attention. It feels so good, right? You feel appreciated, you feel respected. And that's the biggest gift we can give to people. And maybe it's time when we could start learning how to do it, because there are things that we do not know. And inclusion problems are invisible to those who don't face them. Even if you haven't experienced something, it does not mean it does not exist. So what can we do? Actually, during the pandemic, we can attend more online events with more diverse speakers and attendees. Even thinking about this event, if this was in one location, it wouldn't have had such an audience. And we also can connect with people who are different than us. These online events can be more accessible, for example, to people who couldn't, for a disability, go to a physical meetup, who maybe need to adjust sound so they could hear better. And all this can help us learn a little bit more and gain more information. And just being there for our colleagues, family, and friends can help us to understand them more and acknowledge that there are things that we do not know. But the important thing in all of these things is hearing the different perspectives out and not brushing it off. I still remember how sometimes in my career, there were moments when a male colleague would say that a wage gap does not exist. And it was so frustrating and almost impossible to understand how someone could say that this doesn't exist. And they would then find articles which are, approving their theory, even though there are all kinds of articles if you look for any kind of topic, right? The confirmation bias. So maybe sometimes we could just listen a little bit more and hear out a little bit more and try to understand it. Even if we don't face this, maybe others do, and the pain can be really real for them. The one book that I definitely can recommend, it's called Invisible Women. And it has a lot of eye-opening facts about the world and how the world was created with using men as default. One of the facts from this book, which is very relevant these days, is that 71% of women wear protective clothing that isn't designed for women's bodies. So this is very common in medical field, but that's not the only thing. We live and we think that the world was always designed this way, that it's supposed to be this way, but it was designed with certain biases and flaws. Another example would be the car crashes. Women are more likely statistically to get injured or die in car crashes because for years, car safety tests were done with average male bodies dummy. So women's bodies were not even considered in certain safety tests. Another field is pharmaceutical because lots of trials just had men participate there. So it's a very eye-opening book to understand that a lot of things are not what we maybe should have built them to be. So let's not ignore half of humanity. And it's hard to actually hear these facts, but they can be very beneficial. And the one thing that they always say on how to increase inclusion is lend your privilege. In the Corona times, especially, we can see it as being a helper. For example, your neighbor needs help with groceries, and in general, just trying to understand your privilege and helping out local businesses or in all kinds of different ways. But the other part of lending your privilege is just being an ally and somehow understanding that even if you got something a certain way, others may work as hard as you and they may not get it just because they don't have as much privilege as you do. And this realization can help a lot, especially to help others by lending your privilege. So how do you do this? Well, first of all, of course, we have to understand what environment we are in and acknowledge the problems there are and learn how we could help and whom we could help. And this is a very difficult task, as complex as human beings are. And it requires a safe space. If there's no trust, if there's no safety, it's very hard to hear about inclusion problems. It's also, it can be even off-putting that you're trying to help someone. So you have to make sure that there is trust there. And how could you do it? Well, you could lend your voice against certain microaggressions or innocent jokes and just show an example to others of conscious including. The one fact from Invisible Women book is as well that men are twice as likely to interrupt than women are. So maybe if you are in a meeting and you are seeing that a non-male colleague is always getting for some reason interrupted and not included into conversation, maybe especially as male, you could speak up and say, hey, please, can you give your opinion, and we'd love to hear it. These things come so naturally that it's very hard sometimes to question them. And another example would be that there was once this trainer who was teaching something about programming, let's say Java, and she happened to be a woman. And a lot of comments under her course were, wow, you're gorgeous, go out with me, and things like that. And then when she actually wrote on Twitter saying that, hey, this is not cool, this does not happen for male trainers, and me as a woman teaching a tech subject, I get comments like this. A lot of responses to this were, why don't you just take a compliment? And the thing is that this woman saying something back and saying, hey, this is not a compliment, may be understood as, oh, you're just not getting the joke. You're not understanding this. But if a man says something in the same thread and says, hey, this is not cool, we should not objectify women, and if this is a tech course, maybe comments would be more appropriate if they are about tech course. So only men stepping into that thread could speak some sense. And the interesting part, not interesting, important part is that you are someone's example and someone is looking up to you. So that can be very beneficial if we help each other and actually try to show example for others. And I really hate labels. I do mention labels quite a little bit here in this presentation, but try to avoid labels, especially if you speak about inclusion and diversity. Nobody is just inclusive or diverse, let's say, team, because there's so many dimensions there. Even if we say that we are inclusion advocates, well, it's a great wish to be an inclusion advocate. However, it's a journey. We always are learning and growing, and we may do some actions which are not as inclusive. So I feel like saying that something is inclusive and yeah, you should just take it is a little bit lazy, and it tells that maybe it's not as inclusive. And we shouldn't tell others to do what you did, because we often have advice as our default response, but it's not maybe the case that they didn't do what you did, and it doesn't work for them that way. And we may be more privileged than them, and it worked for us. So maybe we could also speak more about how we could help them in a sense of lending privilege or social capital, or introducing them, including them somewhere to reach their goals. And the very important thing is, when we give advice, maybe first we should try to understand the problem. Because often we go with the very first advice monster that comes to our head, and we think, oh yes, I know what you mean, and I will give you this advice. And I still remember one of the first advices that I got from my colleague, who was, be bold. I was doubting myself, and then they said, be bold, and that will solve all my problems. It didn't, and I felt like I was stupid for even sharing these problems that I had. So let's try to understand the problem first and see how we could help them. The nice graphic as well that I found was 3 ways allies can support women of color at work during COVID-19. So it's very similar things that I mentioned here. The one thing is that we could attend more virtual events hosted by women of color. Definitely online events are helping us to reach all kinds of diverse speakers, so we can learn more about their experiences and how we could be better allies. And if in certain remote meetings there are some microaggressions or innocent jokes taking place, try to speak up and lend your voice and be an advocate for creating a nicer environment which is more inclusive. And of course, we should try to build genuine and authentic relationships with other women of color. And we have to try to find similarities rather than differences when it comes to people. And we do have similar hopes and dreams as human beings. So inclusion is a lot about understanding similarities and pain points that maybe for us are invisible. The other lesson that I think is extremely valuable in this pandemic is that we are valuing vulnerability way more, and we are regaining human connection. So what's happening right now is that we can appreciate imperfection a little bit more, and we can say thanks for vulnerability. And I really hope that we can do it as a new usual, because it is creating trust, connection, and safer spaces. And inclusion needs a safe space, because most of inclusion problems we do not spot until we get to know them. And we can get to know them only if we believe people and give them space to express it. And I think it's also a good time to see some failures. So maybe it's a lesson not to be afraid to fail trying, because if people matter, inclusion matters, I would say making mistakes also matters. In this shattering of the perfect world and society's views on perfect roles as leaders, bosses who know everything, I think it's actually moving towards empathy if we admit that we all are on the journey. We're not just one way or another, that we can make mistakes. And some of the examples that I spotted was a boss that turned into a potato on Microsoft Teams meeting and couldn't figure out how to turn off the setting. And they were like this the whole meeting. So this is really funny, first of all, and it went viral. However, I also think it shows the empathy and the heart of this company, and the fact that they're fine not to be this perfect. They're not sitting in a suit and trying to look very serious. It is putting some more heart into the work and the fact, hey, this is not what maybe actually matters that much, how you look, which is ridiculous, right? You turn into a potato. Another example I found is this programmer got a tweet saying that, hey, maybe your site got hacked because it looks really strange. And they said, wow, I was teaching my kids to code yesterday and must have uploaded it by accident. And I really like this example because it's, first of all, it's showing the learning curve, that you have to start somewhere, that you do start with very basic things when you're learning to code, and it's inspiring. Another thing is, yeah, it's imperfect. They by accident push something that they shouldn't have, and it's showing more heart, and as well connecting us more to this person as a parent. So vulnerability, I think, is really courageous, and it can teach us a lot. The other lesson I think the pandemic is teaching us is that accessibility and flexibility are more important. And before the pandemic, maybe we didn't see it in these kinds of extents. So the one thing that I definitely think we can do while we are still facing accessibility problems is voice over how we could improve, and maybe improve as well while we are still facing some issues when it comes to the systems, events, setups. Maybe it should be a new normal for all events to have virtual streaming as well, because it could include more people, the ones who cannot leave the house. And as well, the setups, right? Some companies struggled a lot with work from home, and systems, even governmental systems, had problems and continuing to work. So maybe it's time to actually try to change it and make it a little bit more accessible to everyone. And other things are related to flexibility and what we could do within our team. So the one thing that we can definitely do is also agree on working hours with your team. In my team, we did make it very clear on what work hours we have, and it was building a lot of trust and connection within our team, and we could work better with each other. And for this, we needed some asynchronous communication, meaning that I do not need to be online the same time as my colleague. We could still exchange emails, and we could still work on issues together. And we could actually keep each other's backs more, which for me is also a very nice thing and related with human connection, that we learn to collaborate more. And for example, in my team, we saw that some people struggle with internet connection, and I struggle with internet connection as well sometimes. We said that, okay, if you are presenting this and your internet connection breaks, I will be a plan B. I will step in and I'll be ready to present if you break off. And this really helped our team. We felt maybe more united than before because we could keep each other's backs more and know that we have trust and we are there for each other. And all of this needs a lot of transparency and honesty. And this, I think, pandemic is showing that it's not the default, it's not the normal in some setups. And maybe it's time to actually challenge this and try to seed more transparency and honesty. And we can over-communicate consciously and say, hey, you know, today I have to take care of the kids in the morning, so then I'll be working in the afternoon. And all this can help us to build very high-performing teams, I would say, when we are working remote, and seed very nice values. But when it comes to remote work, let's not forget that this is not just remote work. This is remote work in a lockdown during the global pandemic. So you should not push people and not expect velocity. It is stressful the way it is. Sometimes companies say, oh, here are the tips, top 10 tips how to work from home, from people who worked from home before the pandemic already. And it was different. There was no pandemic, there was no anxieties all around us and uncertainties. And yeah, kindergartens were open. So there is lots of things that are happening here. And if you are still working remote from home, we have to try to not push people too much and concentrate more on what actually matters, which is connection and empathy, and not these velocity norms or dashboards, how people connect to VPN. I'm not giving you ideas, that's a very bad example. And the last lesson that I think is extremely important, that let's redefine the new normal. Maybe it's time for us to have more empathetic leadership, inclusivity, and connection. How could we do it? Well, let's consider inclusion, because inclusion does matter from what we see. If we care about people, we should take care that they are feeling like they belong. And we can do this by questioning ourselves, others, institutions, and ideology, and seeding and seeking empathy, be it politics, companies, or other people. And we have to acknowledge our privilege and biases, and we're all privileged in one way or another, more or less. And lend this privilege, be it voicing our concerns, sharing course, helping, or just listening, opening our hearts to learn a little bit more information and see how we could help. And avoid labels. Really, because saying that something is a certain way is not helping solve any kind of problem. We can do a little bit more, we can be a little bit more human, and we can fail, learn, and grow continuously. And these are the times when we want to adapt, reset, and we can question status quo, we want it or not. Maybe we could make the new reality somehow better. And this photo is from my balcony. And it was one of the weekends, and I was just sitting there, drinking my coffee, reading my magazine, enjoying the sun. And I was thinking, wow, I'm so privileged. I'm privileged in general to have a balcony. How many people do not have it? I have space in my house. Not a house, I live in an apartment, but I have room, and I do not have kids, so I'm also having it fairly easy, come to think of it. And I had this magazine on my table which said, everything will be okay. And it's a Lithuanian magazine. On the cover, it has a Wonder Woman and a medical professional. And I was thinking about privilege. I was thinking about acquaintances who say, oh no, I cannot travel anymore. And I was thinking, hey, you know, maybe it's time when we can actually empathize a little bit more with others who couldn't travel before anyway. Maybe we can see inequity a little bit more obviously, and maybe everything shouldn't be just okay, and maybe we shouldn't get back to the normal. Maybe we could make it a little bit better. Maybe we could make it a new normal. And I'm an idealist, so I do have a vision of the new normal that I believe in, which is that We learn from uncertainty and admit that we're all on a continuous journey. We're not just inclusive or not. And we can learn more about ourselves and others, and we can empathize. That we can have more diverse and consciously more inclusive tech teams. That we create human-first, flexible workplaces. And that we have accessibility prioritized. And we have privileged lending. It's way more common than it is right now. And in new normal, we are sharing emotional, organizational, and household work. And I added this point because it's also more obvious than ever that non-male members of organizations or household or even teams are often having more emotional and all kinds of coarse labor. So maybe we could learn how to share this and try to create a little bit better new normal. And let's consider communication and have it a little bit more considerate, a little bit with more heart, and think of wording so that we don't just use a label, because that's quite lazy to say, hey, this is inclusive, why are you questioning this? No, let's be like, okay, tell us your point and let's try to see how we could improve it. And I hope in this new normal, we value vulnerability way more and we don't use it against people, we use it for people, and that we have empathy-driven leadership. And if there's one thing that I want you to remember from this presentation, it's this. In the rush to return to normal, use this time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, I'm here.
Thank you so much, Lina. There are some questions and some comments in the chat. I don't know if you've been following those, but
no, I wasn't.
Go through. Okay, okay. We have, I think the first question was from Tom, and I'll just read it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that hiring for culture fit is always a bad thing? We often discuss this when hiring at my workplace, but the culture we refer to is one of openness and respect. Those who have rejected from a role for poor cultural fit have been those who have failed to show respect to, for instance, younger female members of the team.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't think it's always a bad thing. It depends what a company means with culture fit. Often also companies are hiding a little bit, like with these labels saying that we have openness and so on, but they actually are also looking for people who are somehow confirming their ideas. And if they are fine also to be challenged, I think it's totally okay to say that we're hiring for culture, which is a big part, right? But it's again labels, and I would definitely say it depends on the company's actual effect, because I have seen companies which say they hire for culture fit and with very similar explanation that they want transparency and respect, and then they also wanted people with similar ideas who wouldn't challenge them. So it's a complex matter, but I'd say see what your company is, and if there's something that is questionable in this hiring, maybe it could be improved, and so on.
Thank you, Lina. There was a follow-up comment from Veronica, and the question that she added is, or she writes, the question to ask is, what is that culture? I think there are many unwritten cultural rules which are not posted visibly on the walls.
Absolutely. This is so related with these labels, because we say our culture is, very transparent or open, or we're very inclusive, we're very diverse. But those unwritten rules are actually what makes a culture, because in marketing, there can be a lot of things that are there. But what actually is the culture is for someone to say who is in that culture.
Thank you. Tom and Veronica, if you're in the call, if you feel that these have been answered, your questions or addressed, great. If not, please write in the chat, or you are welcome, if you have a question, anyone in the call, to unmute yourself, of course.
Tom says, thank you, good answer.
Thank you.
Another comment about jokes. I think at one moment you discussed jokes in the workplace, and the comment Veronica offers, jokes about people are not for the workplace. East Asians and Corona as a joke is not inclusive.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes you could be said that you do not have a humor sense if you're not laughing from this joke. And I've been in these situations when someone gives a funny comment about a woman being in tech. And if you are not approving, they would say, oh, you don't have humor sense. But I'd say if jokes are putting people down, that's not funny. It's not a joke.
Right now in the chat, I think those were the questions that I've seen. Of course, I could have missed, so please let me know if that's the case. And there are so many shout outs, so many thank yous, so many good presentations. So please, I hope you have a read through that. Before I forget, there was one practical question, and it was about how the possibility of sharing the recording of this talk, your talk, Lina, to a diversity group in a workplace. And if we can also talk about this later, but if you feel like you can answer now.
Absolutely. It's okay, of course. And if you want to talk more about any kinds of topics, please feel free to reach out to me. It's a very complex topic. It has many layers, and we're here talking about a little part of it. I also wrote Inclusion Matters series, and I added a reference slide if you want to learn a little bit more. Maybe an interesting comment is that the second part, actually I give some examples of common inclusion problems, because I think we have to know the problems in order to try to help and how to increase inclusion. And that part was a little bit controversial in a sense, because there were some readers who wrote to me and said, hey, no, I never thought that this would happen. It doesn't happen. And then they said, could you please tell more about innocent jokes or something like that? And I was surprised because I thought this is normal. And a lot of people actually are a little bit surprised to hear that there are daily problems like this. Yeah. Any other comments, questions?
Hey Lina, it's Stuart here.
Hi Stu.
Just want to say, firstly, massive thank you. You've put so much work and effort into this. It's obviously a big part of you, and that came across amazingly well throughout. And I just wanted to say a sort of thank you, really. I always thought that I was a fairly inclusive person. I've always thought that I tried to hire in my privileged position to be more inclusive, but even I wasn't even scratching the surface. So I just wanted to say thank you for helping me to open my eyes and see that even I've got a long way to go on my journey to cover even half of what you talked about this evening. So I just wanted to say thank you and go from there, really.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's the first step and the most important one, to admit that it's a continuous journey, that everyone makes mistakes. I've done also things that were not as inclusive, and it's very painful to hear that because you think you're better than that. But as long as you're willing to admit that it's a learning opportunity, it's a good thing. All right, do we have more questions? I'll stop sharing so then I can see what's written there.
I have a comment about language, the way people just normally talk. So I'm from the southern part of Africa, and I'm attending a Deutsch class. I'm the only person from Africa. And there was a word, peinlich, and we were asked to explain what that word means. And nobody could say what it is. And the teacher said it's when I turn red. And I was thinking, I don't turn red when I'm embarrassed. So just things that usually people like miss, but that they could be more aware of.
Nice comment, great.
There is a new comment in the chat, Lina. Do you want to take that, or would you like me to read that?
I can read that. Do you see a difference in how corporations apply code of conduct? I see code of conduct for ensuring a work environment free from harassment, but in some companies, I experience that people use code of conduct against others, like being feared, not speaking about certain things. This, I'd say, also is related with this, my hated labels and the fact that we could say, oh yeah, we are doing fine. What are you talking about? Our code of conduct says that we're fine. And it for sure can be used against people. And if the environment is not safe to question, then it can be quite difficult to work against this, because when someone says, I'm right, you're wrong, that's quite a difficult argument to fight against. I don't know, maybe actually Jenna or Susanna, you would like to add something about code of conduct?
Nothing specific about the code of conduct, but the issue of labeling remind me about the question of the label ally and the concept of allyship, because one of the most helpful descriptions of this, of what it means to be an ally is that not to get hung up on the label and saying I'm an ally, because as soon as you start to make an identity out of it, you can forget that it's a process. And as you said, Lina, it's a learning journey that comes with making mistakes and learning from these and making amends and so on. So I very much like what you're saying about avoiding the labels, as that they can be a trap. But the code of conduct, I mean, we're learning as we go with this too. So I don't know that I have so much to add right now. Do you have any thoughts about it, Susanna?
Well, I think it shouldn't say that you should not be allowed to say something, but it's of course then some certain people are writing the code of conduct again. Of course, you have your own privileges and have your own view of things and might miss out on other things. So that's actually also a thing that should happen, a very diverse team. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be a very good code of conduct.
Absolutely. Great points. The one comment that I see that I can add a little bit more. So Veronica said, what about courage? We need more of that for inclusion. I think Brené Brown has said that vulnerability is courage. So I think if we are open and we are imperfect, it's extremely courageous, to show up the way you are and to actually be okay to be vulnerable. So I think it's very important, because vulnerability is important. Making mistakes is important as well. So yes, absolutely, this is courage. I see that there's a comment from Hitesh. Sometimes you have biases which are based on your experiences and not the general perception. And since it is based on the experience, it is almost truth for you. Applying that everywhere not only hurts others, but it hurts you as well, personally and professionally. How do you actually overcome with that? Oh, this is a toughie, right? So it's again an overgoing continuous journey, because you may not realize that you are biased. You see it as a normal behavior. Sometimes I even think that we tend to flip the coin, and we may think that these people are acting wrong and not us. And how to actually overcome it, I'm not sure, because we have to somehow open our hearts and try to understand the person. I always say that if you have some kind of problem with someone, then the thing I would recommend would be get to know them more. Go for lunch for the person that you think you dislike the most, because you will find out more things about them, and you will be able to see what you are doing that's hurting them as well, because likely it's a double kind of thing. It's not only one way. So biases are, acknowledging and learning more about them, learning more from people that you can trust, getting more feedback. That's, I guess, the only way to learn more and admit that we are on a journey. We're not just one way or another. So there's no easy answer here. Sorry. Any more comments? Oh, thank you. Comments, questions? If not, then you can feel free to contact me. There will be a recording as well, and we can wrap up. Would you like to say something, Jenna and Susanne, as a last word?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really, really interesting and very good presentation.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for your time.
Thanks everyone for joining.